interested in early career opportunities. I did keep experienced careers in the agenda just in case anyone has any questions about how that works and what that hiring process is like. But the focus will definitely be on early careers. So the kinds of programs and jobs that we recruit for from recent college graduates. A little bit about me. So I went to Fresno State, like Hernan said, I'm an alum of LCOE. My background is in mechanical engineering. I was really involved in SWE. I did other stuff, but this slide was for a presentation that I gave to SWE a while ago. So I didn't bother to add in everything else. So it's pretty SWE specific, but I was also involved in ASME, Tau Beta Pi, helped out with SHIP and SACE and NSBE with outreach and things like that. So pretty involved in the college. I had a few different internships when I was in college at Southern California Edison, Schneider Electric, and then finally Thermo King, which is part of Trane Technologies. And that's how I got my current full-time role. I'm in the Accelerated Development Program, which I'll talk about in this presentation. It's one of our early career programs at Trane Technologies. But it's a rotational program, so I'm in my second rotation right now. So I've had 2 different roles as part of this program. And in January, I'll be starting my 3rd role. My first role was a product engineer on the centrifugal chiller team. And then currently I'm in the applications engineering team. So if you're interested in what those roles entail, then you can definitely ask me more about it. But for now, I'll just move on to a little bit more information about the company. So Trane is a pretty old company. We recently spun off from the other half of our business. We used to be called Ingersoll Rand, so that was kind of the parent company. But we spun off in 2020 last year. So Trane Technologies is our new like corporate parent company. So that's a new one as of 2020, but the kind of children companies are pretty old. So Trane is the oldest one, founded in 1913. And then Thermo King is another one of our kind of subsidiary companies that was founded in 1938. And it's a global company. So the official headquarters is in Ireland, but all of our executives are in North America, based in Davidson, North Carolina. A few quick stats. We have 528 facilities in North and South America. So pretty large company that includes sales offices. So that's quite a bit of it. But we also have tons of manufacturing facilities and engineering facilities as well. And then EMEA is our Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. And then India, we sometimes lump into that as well. And then Asia Pacific is our 3rd kind of region. So definitely a global presence, about 36,000 employees. So we have 3 different major brands, or we sometimes call them strategic business units. So these are the kind of subsidiary companies that I was talking about before. One of them is commercial HVAC. That's the business unit that I work for currently. Although in the rotational program, I'm an employee of our corporate organization. We also have residential HVAC and then transport refrigeration, which is like the coolers that you'll see on the back of trucks, which is what we have in the picture here. The thing that really attracted me to Trane Technologies and made me decide to work there was the emphasis on sustainability. The company is very, very focused on that. We have a few large goals that I'm going to show in the next slide that the entire company is working towards. That's mostly what I left the slide in here to talk about. The rest of it is kind of like marketing stuff about, how the world is changing and how we're part of it. But the goals that I want to talk about, the biggest one is our gigaton challenge, which is reducing our customers' carbon emissions by a gigaton within the next decade. So they set that goal last year in 2020, and by the year 2030, we're aiming to reduce customers' carbon footprints by a gigaton. which is quite a bit. And we do that through our product portfolio, so creating more efficient products and creating products that use electricity instead of natural gas or oil as fuel sources. And then also through our energy services and controls. So going and making customers' buildings more energy efficient and creating control strategies to use less energy as well. We also have some goals that are focused on our facilities. So reaching carbon neutral operations and zero waste by 2030, and then also net positive water usage. And we also have a lot of strong diversity, equity, and inclusion goals as well. So that's kind of the opportunity for all piece. This is just kind of talking more about our goals, but it's basically the same stuff. So I talked a little bit about some of our products when I was talking about the different business units, but this is a little more detail. So on the Trane side, that's the brand for both the residential and commercial business units that I mentioned. We have a variety of cooling and heating products. The commercial business unit is focused largely on chillers. We have water cooled and air cooled chillers. And then we also have like unitary equipment, so rooftop units that you see, sitting on rooftops of buildings. That's pretty popular for large and light commercial businesses. I don't really know as much about the residential products, but pretty much any HVAC units you would need in your house. And then controls and energy services is another big part of that business. Thermo King, we have transport refrigeration for trucks, trailers, marine, and rail. So quite a broad portfolio there as well. None of that stuff really meant anything to me until I started working in HVAC. But if it means anything to you, that's pretty cool. Basically, we serve a lot of different industries with a pretty wide product portfolio. So a lot of cool stuff here. So a lot of our jobs are really large, especially since I work in commercial HVAC. We have some really large accounts for customers with, hundreds of buildings across the country. So we get some pretty interesting and complicated jobs. I never thought that I was going to work in HVAC. When I was an engineering student, it didn't really sound that interesting. And it wasn't, particularly a goal of mine. But when I had my internship with Thermo King, I realized that there was really a lot more to it. And I became really interested in the energy services part of the business, which is essentially making buildings more energy efficient. And then from there, I just saw a lot of really interesting things that the company was doing and realized that it's a good fit for me. So you may not have considered HVAC before, but it's definitely, it definitely can be more fun than it sounds, is what I would say. Oh, I meant to hide this slide. I don't really care about the finances, but if you're interested in any of that, then you can take a look at how we're doing kind of as a business. So now I'll get into, well, I guess I'll leave some time for questions. If anyone has questions about the company as a whole, any of our sustainability goals, anything like that before I start talking about our internship and early career job opportunities. Any questions here? Okay, then I will jump into this. So the first internship program that I'm going to talk about is called EPIC, which stands for Enterprise. I don't remember the rest of the letters, but basically we have 3 different options for internships. There's this program. There's a program for technical sales, which I'm also going to talk about. And then the third option would be a direct hire internship, which is not an enterprise. So the enterprise internships are organized by corporate HR, and they kind of organize across all of the business units, all of the teams in the company to match interns with the job opportunity that they're most interested in. Direct hire internships are just posted straight to our career site, and they're posted just by the hiring manager. So you're just applying to one very specific internship with one very specific team. Whereas the EPIC internship, you don't necessarily apply to a specific internship. You kind of apply to the program as a whole, and then you will be matched with an internship that's a good fit for you. So some details on this internship. They are typically 12 weeks, but that is pretty flexible. So if you have some other things going on in your summer, we'll work with you around that. And the key point about the internships is that they feed into the rotational program, accelerated development program, which I'm going to talk about later. And just, oh, I should have asked you all for your majors, or sorry, not your majors, your year in school or graduation date. You can put that in the chat if you want to. But just to kind of give you all a heads up, we don't have any openings left in the accelerated development program. So if you are graduating in the next year, this spring, then that is probably not an option for you unless you're doing a master's program, then you can do an internship. But if you're not graduating within the next year, oh, awesome, Lucas is a freshman. So as a freshman, we do still have some openings on our career site for the EPIC internship program. And for the accelerated development program, we hire from our EPIC interns. That's kind of the first candidate pool that we look at. And typically we fill all of those positions with the interns. So it's pretty hard to get into the accelerated development program without having been an intern in the prior year. So super awesome to see that we have some underclassmen in here. That's why I wanted to come and do this presentation to hopefully get those of you that are still interested in internships at this point. And Lucas, I'll drop a link into the chat for our career site where you can apply. Yeah, so definitely good to have an internship if you're interested in the rotational program, because we really feed right into that with the internships. Pretty good benefits for the internship program as well. That was the highest pay that I ever got as an intern, which it changes every year, so I don't know what it is now. But I think it was like $24 an hour when I interned or something like that, maybe 25. You do get relocation. So for the most part, almost every EPIC intern that I've known has had to move for the job because they want you to, be exposed to other parts of the company and different geographic areas and things like that. But you do get relocation benefits. So they give you a lump sum for the internship. And that was definitely my most fun internship as far as having other interns to hang out with. At all of our EPIC intern locations, there are multiple interns. And usually it's, you get a lot of that kind of networking and social interaction. So that's definitely a fun part of it. So like I said, the EPIC internship program feeds into our rotational program, the accelerated development program. So I'll tell you guys about that now. And like I said, we don't have any openings for this for the upcoming year for 2022 cohort. But if you're interested, then definitely apply for an internship so that you'll be in the candidate pool. So the accelerated development program is meant to develop leadership skills along with technical skills. That's what I enjoyed about it or was most interested in. I was specifically looking for rotational programs when I graduated because I wanted to try out some new things. I felt like I was only able to see a little bit of engineering based on my summer internships. So I wanted to get some more experience before I kind of settled down into a permanent role. And out of all of the rotational programs that I saw at different companies, this one had The best kind of split, I would say, between technical skill development and technical work, and still kind of having an emphasis on developing leadership. It's not as prescriptive as a lot of the other rotational programs I've seen, um, by which I mean a lot of other rotational programs have a very rigid structure as far as what rotations you move through. Like they'll tell you, you're going to be in this team in this rotation, and then you're going to go to this team. And they really try to push you into a certain type of role when you're done with the program. A lot of them are really geared towards getting you into management. With this rotational program, you mostly get to choose your roles. I mean, it depends on the business need at the time, and you don't choose the first one. But for everything after that, you can kind of ask around the company, see what you're interested in, maybe even do some shadowing in your current role to decide what you want to do next. And you also, it is encouraging leadership, but the company recognizes that there are a lot of different ways to be a leader. So it's not necessarily management. You could be a technical leader and become a subject matter expert, or you could be a business leader and go into product management, or a people leader if you do want to do that and become a manager. But it's not really trying to push you into any specific role. It's really based on what you're interested in. So you are a full-time employee in this program. Like, you're really in the job. You're a regular employee. It's just a temporary job, and you get a little extra development on top of it than what you would normally do as a kind of traditional direct hire. So there are some extra leadership opportunities. We have some like ADP specific groups in the company. Like, we have an ADP newspaper that you can write articles for, be an editor for, some kind of little things like that. We have some learning events. We have a symposium every year where we all fly to headquarters for a week and have a week of like development sessions and workshops and things like that. And then we also get a lot of leadership exposure. So at the symposium that I just mentioned, we will sometimes talk to some of the C-suite executives, vice presidents of engineering of every business unit, just all kinds of leaders like that. And we get some kind of special networking events with leaders throughout the year. Any questions on either EPIC or ADP? Awesome. Oh, and it is a global program as well, but you stay in the region that you were hired in. So in North America, you stay in North America. You don't usually, in fact, almost never, I don't think I've heard of an ADP getting an international assignment. But we do get to work with the ADPs in other regions. So we'll be on calls and like networking events with them. So that's pretty cool. You get a little bit of cultural exchange there as well. And we do have different functional tracks, so you can network outside of engineering as well if you're interested in learning more about other parts of the business. So for engineering, you have 3 rotations. With it, I guess I should back up for a second. With an engineering degree, you can go into operations, IT, or engineering. Obviously, engineering is the most common, but with mechanical, or probably with a civil degree as well, you can go into operations. So that would be like manufacturing, supply chain, procurement, materials, things like that. And then for computer science or computer engineering, you can go into information technology. For engineering, we have 3 rotations, 1 year, 6 months, and then another year. And there are some kind of examples on here. Like I mentioned before, one of the things that I like about this program is that it's pretty flexible. You can choose jobs that you're interested in. It's not like prescribed that you're going to do this job and then this job and then this job. But they do have some kind of suggested roles to help you get a diverse experience and see a lot of different parts of the company, since that's, kind of the value of a rotational program. So just kind of some different examples listed out here. I have had a pretty atypical path. My first rotation was a new technology project, which is a little more advanced. That's normally something that you would do in your last rotation. But it, happened to be available at the time and I was interested in it. The 6-month rotation, we sometimes call cross-functional or diverse rotation. It's the goal is to help you kind of experiment a little bit and try something outside of engineering or a different kind of less traditional type of engineering if you're interested in it, like test engineering. They consider a little different than like a new product development or sustaining engineering kind of role. Or if you're interested in something outside of engineering, like product management, project management, operations, like manufacturing, things like that, you can do that. Like I mentioned, I'm doing applications engineering. I'm the first ADP this team has had, so it's kind of a new role for the rotational program. But, again, to the point, you can kind of shop around and see what you're interested in and work out your own rotation. So I was interested in this, and even though it wasn't like a typical rotation, I was able to join the team for 6 months. So that's kind of, I guess, a very quick kind of overview of the timeline of the rotational program. Any questions on this? Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah, so just a quick question. So when you apply for like one particular position, let's say, and it's available across various locations across North America, so will you be considered for all the locations, or will it be considered only for the location you are applying in? And then you will be rotating in the different departments in that location.
So for the position that you applied to, since that is a direct hire position for that co-op, that would only be in one location and it wouldn't be rotational. You would just do the job that you applied to. For the rotational program, you do rotate to different areas. So typically, kind of going back to this timeline that I have on the slide here, you might be in the same location for your first and second role and then move for your third role. Or sometimes be in one location for your first role and then move for the second and third. So you would have 2 or 3 moves depending on where you go when you roll off of the program. But if you do apply to a direct hire position, so not, a position that doesn't say ADP or Epic, that would just be directly hiring into that one position in that one location. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so criteria for both of these programs, above 3.0 GPA, I would say most of these criteria, there's a little bit of flexibility. If you're really, really strong in certain aspects, then you might have a little wiggle room, but I would say that I don't think I've seen anyone get hired with below a 3.0 GPA. So that tends to be a pretty solid requirement. Because it's a leadership development program for both of them, I mean, Epic feeds into ADP, so it's kind of the same set of criteria. We want to see leadership experience. For ADP, there's definitely a minimum of 2 examples. For Epic, again, a little more wiggle room. If you're a freshman or a sophomore, you might be fine with only having 1 leadership experience. But it doesn't have to be technical or related to the job. It could be something like a sports team captain or something like that. By the time you get to ADP, you probably want to have leadership that's actually relevant to the job. So technical leadership experience. Work experiences, for upperclassmen, we look for at least one internship, one relevant internship. For underclassmen, it's probably fine if you don't have any, but maybe, you know, include an example of like a class project that you did or something like that in lieu of work experience. And for ADP, by the time that you're graduating, 2 relevant internships. But we have been making exceptions for internships that were canceled due to COVID. So if you did get an internship that was canceled due to COVID, just write a line in there on your resume. And I think that other employers are making the same exception, so would definitely recommend including that on your resume. And then to the point that Ronnie just brought up, it is a geographic rotation as well as job rotation. So you have to be able to relocate. And it says anywhere in the US. Our main locations are La Crosse, Wisconsin, Tyler, Texas, Davidson, North Carolina, Clarksville, Tennessee. We do have some operations in Lynn Haven, Florida, but that's not as common for engineering. Minneapolis, Minnesota, or St. Paul, Minnesota, which is right next to Minneapolis. We have some operations in Trenton, New Jersey, but again, that's more operations. That's less for engineering, more for manufacturing. Am I leaving anything out? Oh, Lexington, Kentucky. Oh, Pueblo, Colorado is the last big one. So it is a pretty good geographic spread, but not very much on the West Coast. But again, that is only for our main like design and manufacturing centers. We have sales offices literally across the country. So if you're interested in a direct hire position at a sales office, then there are way more options in California if you're looking to stay local. That pretty much wraps it up for ADP and Epic. So Jamil had a question, would you request where you want to go, or does the company decide that? For your first rotation, pretty much the company decides. You know, when you're going through the interview process, you can indicate where you're interested in, and they might try, or they do try to take that into consideration. But once you're in the program, you know, you can kind of network inside of the company, talk to different managers, and find a role in the place of your preference. So it does kind of, it requires some work on your part to find roles in the place that you want to go. But people do typically have pretty good success with, you know, say if they want to be in Texas, finding a role in Tyler, Texas, and saying, okay, I want to do this for my next rotation. And then the company is pretty good about accommodating that. You bet. All right, so that's on ADP and Epic. The next one I'm going to go over is technical sales. So this is another early career program where we look for, well, there's an internship, obviously, if you're still in college, and then the graduate training program hires directly out of college, just like ADP. So to start with the internship, like Epic, it's also 12 weeks over the summer. You get coaching and mentoring, hands-on experience with sales, and then job shadowing existing sales engineers. And like Epic feeds into ADP, this technical sales internship feeds into the graduate training program. So the graduate training program, people compare it to the rotational program a lot, but it is pretty different. The similarity is that it hires right out of college, but pretty much everything else is different. This is a really old program. It was originally in 1926. So you meet all of these like old people in the company who, you know, went through the program back in like the 60s or 70s or something like that. And the way that this works, so in ADP, like I said, it's geographically mobile. You go to different locations. For the graduate training program, you are hired by one specific sales office. So for example, we have somebody from the Fresno sales office right now. So he was hired by the Fresno sales office, but then your sales office sends you to La Crosse, Wisconsin, for 5 months. So you can do this training program. And then once you finish the training program, you go back to your sales office. So it requires a little bit of geographic flexibility, just in being in Wisconsin for 5 months, but then you go back to your location at the end of that. It's also different in that, so for ADP, you are like a regular full-time employee, like doing a regular job. It's just that you're temporary. For the graduate training program, it's like you're taking classes. It's like more school. So we have these 3 phases listed out on the slide. The first phase is literally like a class, like a lecture. You take a kind of crash course in fundamentals of HVAC, thermodynamics, and then some sales stuff. And it's really like college 2.0. That's what one of our recruiters calls it. You have lectures, you have homework and tests, but fortunately it's only 7 weeks. So it's not like a full semester. The reason for having that kind of crash course in HVAC is that the graduate training program accepts all technical majors. You don't have to know anything about HVAC or thermodynamics at all. Civil engineers, construction management, anything like that, you can apply to this. So we have that kind of phase 1 crash course in HVAC fundamentals because not everyone is a mechanical engineer that knows these things already. Phase 2 is where you learn about our products so that you can actually sell them. So it's super detailed. And actually, when I started, my team recommended that I take a few of these classes or kind of sit in on some of these phase 2 classes to get more familiar with our product portfolio. And then phase 3 is when you learn about like how to actually be a sales engineer. And you do like simulations to kind of practice actually making the sales. I think that pretty much covers it. So the qualifications for GTP, as a technical sales engineer, like, you still have the technical aspect. So you still, are using your engineering skills. So that's why we, hire technical majors. It's not just like any regular sales position. But the communication skills are arguably more important. Actually, I think anyone would acknowledge that. I probably don't have to qualify that by saying arguably more. The communication skills are more important, as a sales engineer. So the GPA requirement is a little bit lower, 2.8. And then it says any discipline of engineering, but I have also seen them take other technical majors as well, like physics. I think construction management would also be accepted. And then again, communication skills, kind of the same thing as leadership experience, but it's not quite as stringent. Whereas ADP, they say, like minimum 2 experiences. For GTP, it's just kind of generally leadership experience. And then kind of generally the characteristics of a sales engineer, competitive, entrepreneurial, motivated by money. So that's kind of the profile that they look for this program. Any questions on technical sales? Awesome. Well, that's kind of the main content of the presentation. Oh, I did leave this in here just in case anyone was interested, but unless anyone has some experience and wants to know more about experienced careers, I'll probably skip this. So you can unmute or type me a comment in the chat if you want me to go over this more. Okay, probably not. I'll skip that. I left a few slides in here about the company culture. I talked about it a little bit in the introduction, but this is another reason why I decided to work for the company. we recruit at a lot of the like affinity engineering organizations. I got my first internship through the Society of Women Engineers. I just recruited at the SHIP conference. I've recruited at the SACE conference before. I'm going to be recruiting at a NSBE conference later this week. So we do quite a lot of this. And we also have we've signed on to a lot of initiatives for advancing minorities in STEM and in HVAC. And have employee resource groups and things like that. We have pretty good benefits. I think the biggest standout would be retirement account. We get a 6% match, which is pretty high for this industry. It's like 3 or 4 would be typical. And then after working 2 years, you get an additional 2%. So overall 8% match. So that's pretty good. I guess I would say comparing it to like other companies in the industry, our benefits are very good. On paper, they might not look as good as like tech companies, like the big name tech companies, but we have really, really good work-life balance. Like that's the big standout when I compare to my friends who are working, in Silicon Valley or similar kind of environments. Like I easily work 40 hours a week, without having to do a bunch of overtime or anything like that. So considering that, I would say our benefits are really good. Oh, and then I kind of kept this, my coworker put the slide in here and I included it just in case anyone is interested. But one of the cool things about starting during COVID sucked in a lot of ways. But it was pretty cool because our industry was really, really important. Our transport refrigeration, we were like transporting vaccines. Our company developed one of the first vaccine storage solutions because it required, really, really low temperature. And then the commercial and residential HVAC, it's been really cool to see the indoor air quality solutions. We've had tons and tons of research into mitigating viruses, like virus particles in indoor spaces. So that's pretty cool. And that's everything I have in here. Any other questions?
Emma, are employees salaried or are they hourly?
As an engineer, you would be salaried. Our manufacturing employees are hourly. So if you were in operations, then you might be working with hourly employees, but yeah, pretty much any job that you would get with an engineering degree would be salaried.
Okay. Great.
Internships are hourly though.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Students, please just turn on your mic. Feel free to ask. It's a great opportunity. Anything else you want to know about Trane Technologies or any of the any other questions you want to know? Anything else you want to know?
I have a question. You said you were going to put the info to apply in the chat, correct?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Let me get you that link.
Thank you.
I should have already had the link copied, but I forgot about that. Okay, so there's the link to our main careers page. And then you can just search whatever you're interested in. If you're interested in EPIC, then just use the keyword EPIC. All of the EPIC internships have that word in the title of the job posting. If you're interested in co-ops or just like any kind of direct hire internship, you can filter by internship as well.
Okay. Do the internship programs, are they sort of structured and formal where they work with all of the interns to do structured activities? things like that at the different locations?
Not necessarily. It depends on your team and your site. So your hiring manager will have, some projects set aside that they want an intern to work on. I would say most of our sites have some kind of intern project where a team sponsors interns to work together, maybe like 10 or 20% of their time. So kind of a side project in addition to what your internship is focused on. But the project just kind of depends on what team you get assigned to. So that's why for our EPIC internship program, the program coordinators try to kind of match you to the position that best suits your interests.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Anything else? Students? Okay.
What is the typical hiring process like, as in the steps to get a final acceptance, and is it different in internships and full-time offers? There definitely is a difference between internships and full-time, because when you're full-time, you get all of the benefits. Whereas when you're an intern, if you're only 12 weeks or even 6 months for a co-op, you don't necessarily get all of the benefits for such a short time. Right, you have access to some. I don't fully know how it all works. So there is a difference in that way. Steps to get a final acceptance. I'm not completely sure everything that happens on the HR side, but there's at least one interview, and then probably some meetings with HR folks to go over benefits, especially for full-time. Another difference would be, for the EPIC internship relocation, you just get a lump sum. I think it's like $2,500, something like that, maybe $1,500. And that's like all of the relocation assistance. For ADP, they actually hire a moving company to move all of your stuff to your new home, and you get a lump sum. So that process is a little more involved.
Great, thanks.
Mhm. Any other questions? Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
It's great to talk to you all. I'd love to see more Fresno State people in Trane Technologies.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you once again, Emma. Thank you for taking the time and speaking to our students about internships and opportunities at Trane Technologies. Okay, and hopefully in the near future we can have you out in person. I know you're far away, but it's always great to see alums come and visit. And as things change and as things improve, we hope to have more in-person events. So, but this works great. Thank you so much. Best of
Yeah.
luck in your professional endeavors. And
Thanks, Hernan.
thank you to all the students for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.